Hey everybody, welcome to episode 60 of the AskDAP show where we answer your Volkswagen and Audi questions. On this episode, we talk about TSI oil pressure issues, Mark 5 engine jerking on the highway, and Mark 7 GTI with suspension spacers left in the vehicle.
Nikita Bonday via email says, I was wondering if you guys could point me in the right direction. I own a 2011 GTI with 32,000 miles. I recently discovered message on my MFD, oil pressure, max RPM 4,000. For approximately 3 seconds. No issues driving, the oil level's fine. Took it to the dealer to see if any codes, and they told me that there is none, and that the oil level was fine with no recommendation. Is this something that could be related to the timing chain tensioner that I've read about? And or what would you recommend?
All right, so you have a Mark 6 GTI 2.0T and you have oil pressure issues. Sounds like you went down the right path of first, obviously, anytime you get oil pressure lights, number one thing you should always do is stop the car immediately and check your oil level. Once you know you have oil in the vehicle, obviously, that you can then proceed. If it just comes on for a couple seconds and then turns off, then you can continue to drive. If your oil light does not turn off, you should never drive your car with an oil light flashing constantly because you could potentially cause damage to your engine. You went to the dealer, they then checked the vehicle and they found no faults. Normally, an oil light is not going to create fault codes in a car, at least at this point. Cars don't work like that yet. That may be something that will likely happen eventually in the future. But what should you do next? Could it be related to the timing chain tensioner? Possibly it is oil pressure driven, but most likely it's not really. A lot of times timing chain tensioner issues are not necessarily causing oil pressure issues, but maybe a problem as a result of oil pressure issues. So when you're going down the road of fixing this issue, really there's only a couple things I can really tell you. Number one, the only way to know if you have oil pressure issues going forward would be to have the oil pressure tested via an oil pressure test tool. Sounds like you probably would want to have a professional do that for you. If you want to do it on your own, obviously you can go down that road, find the oil pressure spec for your vehicle, then do testing to verify it's in spec, and then obviously do it under different conditions to verify that you have good oil pressure. If you do that and everything's fine, there are a couple things that I have thoughts about. Really only one major thing that's a common issue on TSI engines is that there is a small screen that is on the cam adjuster valve. On the passenger side of the engine, there is basically the valve that controls oil flow for variable valve timing. There's a small screen that it's kind of a known thing. It's not a super common problem, but it's a kind of a known thing. Those screens will become loose and then get into the oil pressure system. If that screen were to get clogged into a guide of some kind or a channel, that could potentially cause a temporary oil pressure issue, and then possibly it became dislodged, allowing oil to flow freely, which is why the light is now off now. In that circumstance, if that hypothetical I just laid out is what's going on, there's really not a lot you can do about it, except for making sure maybe you drop the pan and make sure that there's nothing in the pan or in the oil pump pickup. But outside of that, there's not much you can do as a preventative to replacing that. I know there are people who replace that part with a new one, but under that circumstance, that's not really much you're going to be able to do, because finding that piece is pretty much impossible. A lot of times it will get caught, I think, in the camshafts themselves, because the camshafts are hollow and or maybe it's the intermediate shaft that it runs through, and then it will get lodged in there somewhere. So regardless of what you do, you're probably not going to have a solution, but the only way you can be sure is to have the oil pressure checked to verify you have good oil pressure. So hopefully that answers your question and you can address your oil pressure issue.
Hi there, Paul. Thanks for the great advice. I have a problem with the Golf 6 GTI. I replaced the timing chains and tensioner. Now there is a winding sound coming from the cam gear side. Sort of a belt noise. I did remove the alternator belt and started the car. The noise is still there. Been driving the car for a while now and the noise is still there. Does anyone have any ideas?
So you replace the timing chain tensioner and timing chains, and you're saying now you have this issue where you have a noise coming from the engine. My first thought is this: if the noise did not exist before you did this work and then it existed afterwards, you can be pretty certain that whatever it is related to the work performed. My biggest fear is obviously that there's something rubbing on something or something that's not installed properly, which is causing this issue in the first place. If that's true, obviously everything, all the work and everything that's been touched should be gone through to verify that there isn't anything going on specifically causing that issue. But that's my first thought on it. My other thought I had when I saw this was actually that it could potentially be something related to the water pump. The water pump, for anybody who's not familiar, is on the front of the block towards that side of the engine. It also runs off of a belt that's actually on the intermediate shaft. It's like a small belt about yay big. Those water pumps, when they go bad, make noise. I don't know if that's what you're hearing or if it's not, but that would be another possibility. But for sure, I wouldn't go down that road first. Whenever you do a job and then you find something that happens that wasn't there before after you did the job, it's always number one, you should assume that it's related to the work performed and not something else. Because if you want to, if you end up chasing down a phantom issue instead of addressing that it could potentially be the work that was performed in the first place. So good luck finding your issue, and hopefully you can get it taken care of.
David Lynch via email says, I have a 2008 GTI FSI with a DSG transmission and APR Stage 1 software and 53,000 miles. No other aftermarket stuff. I'm hoping you can help me because neither my mechanic or technicians at my dealership know. In the last year, I've had 4 coil packs and spark plugs replaced, thermostat, temp sensor, vacuum pump, vacuum pipe for brake booster with a check valve, all replaced. When I accelerate on the highway in either manual mode or automatic mode, the engine stutters and sputters as I accelerate, 4th, 5th, and 6th gears. No check engine light comes on, no OBD2 codes are thrown. Dealer says there's no VW specific codes in the ECU either. The technician at VW drove the car, thinks changing the transmission fluid will help, but I think it was changed to 26,000 miles when the car's mechatronic unit was recalled. It appears to be getting worse over the last 4 weeks. Help me, OBDeleven DAP, you're my only hope.
So David, I have a couple thoughts about this specifically. Let's start with the transmission and the idea of the DSG transmission flush actually solving your problem. I can say almost with certainty that that's not going to help you. If you're having a DSG transmission issue, changing the fluid is not going to help you. If the DSG is causing this issue, then I would say it's probably either a mechatronics issue or another mechanical issue relating to either the pump or something else or the clutch pack itself that's causing this issue. Here's where I don't know what to tell you next. Let's start with this. If we have misfires, it sounds like what you're describing could be a multitude of things causing it, so I don't really know for sure. I'm going to go down a couple steps of things to look at. First, coils and plugs. You said the coils and plugs are new. If they are indeed new, my first thoughts are make sure they are quality ones, either genuine plugs or let's say Bosch, NGK, something like that. That goes for coils and plugs. I've seen a lot of people buy cheapo like AutoZone or you know, whatever aftermarket, any aftermarket store like that. They generally sell not super high quality ignition coils, which I've seen have issues along the way. So if that's the case, then I would make sure you get known good coils in there, either genuine or Bosch, and the same goes for plugs. If you put in like Autolites or things like that, they almost generally run pretty terrible in VW models. So getting good plugs in there is important. If that's true, let's say you went to a dealer and they put in genuine plugs, genuine coils, and the problem still persists, I would then move down the direction of determining, do you even have a misfire? So I actually just published a video this morning about how to diagnose misfires on cars that's using OBDeleven, which are those scan tools that are on the wall behind me back there. If you're not familiar, I'll link to that here where you can take a look at that video. It shows you how to diagnose a misfire. It also will show you how to determine, to look at the live data to see if you're even having misfires in the first place. So in that circumstance, what you would do is get all the live data running, then go and take your vehicle on one of these pulls where you can duplicate that issue that you're having, and then you would determine live data as to, am I actually having misfires or is there something else going on? If you do find misfires, you're going to find them on most likely specific cylinders, and then you can go down the road of following next. If you have specific misfires on, let's say, cylinder 2 has a misfire that is you see in those higher RPM gears, and it's a dead miss, and every time you're up there, it's always going to do so, and you have new coil, new plug, and it's quality, you probably have a fuel injector problem. That's most likely going to be the cause of it. If that's the case, obviously, I'll put a link to FSI fuel injectors down below where you can check them out. But that's probably your issue, and that would solve your problem most likely if you're having a dead miss on a single cylinder and you verified it is indeed a misfire. If you do that and there are no misfires present, that's when you might want to start looking at transmission-related stuff. But man, that gets super tough. That's really hard for me to tell you how to diagnose if that transmission is having issues. If you haven't serviced the fluid, maybe that's why they're telling you to go down the road of, hey, we have to get fresh fluid in there, which would be a possibility. Let's say you're at 60,000 miles since your last DSG service, and you're having this issue. They might tell you, hey, let's get clean fluid in there, and then we can determine if there's something else going on with the transmission itself. That's pretty much where I'm at. If that's not the case, it's most likely either misfire related or actually mechanically trans related. If it is trans related, you're in for either a mechatronics unit, a clutch pack, or an oil pump, all of which are going to be expensive propositions. So hopefully those are not the ones for you. I'll put a link to all the DSG parts that I'm referring to in the description where you can check them out. But hopefully it's just a misfire and you can get it addressed that way.
The Goody via VW Vortex says, about the OBDeleven, when you talk about getting credits for an app as an example, if I want to dip my mirrors when in reverse, there's an app for that. Am I understanding correctly that when I say that I will have to pay X amount of credits for the app, but once I own the app I can go back in and change the settings on or off as I please, or do I need to buy new credits each time? For the section where I can do the coding myself for no credits, what if I make an error in the code? Will it ruin anything? When we say coding, is this an example of doing the coding manually? Video linked in description. Lastly, is there a difference in GTI and R coding? I found a lot of coding, but it's in the GTI forms.
Okay, so you have questions around OBDeleven, apps, and credits. So the credits are one-time use. They are per use of the app. That one specifically you're referring to, actually the rear mirror dip, and this is something that I think OBDeleven doesn't do a good job in their app stuff explaining, and I'm going to talk to them to try to see if they can do a better job. But in that specific one, there's more that you need to do in the vehicle itself other than just the one-touch coding, and it's not something they can do in their app, so they probably don't have a great way and conceptually for them to actually explain it. But basically you do the app, then you have to set up stuff in the car to allow that dip feature to work properly. So if a lot of people's perception is they push the button, it takes their credits, it doesn't work. The reality is that's not that it didn't work, it's that there's still stuff left to do before it actually will work properly in the vehicle. So that's one-time use. About using it manually. Can you mess stuff up? So on other cars, it really depends on the vehicle. And on Mark 7s, they use mostly adaptation channels to change stuff. So because your adaptation channels, you just change one and then you save it and then it changes things, as long as you have the ability to back them out, then you can't really mess things up. And there's also a feature that OBDeleven has where you can actually email yourself the history of what you've done. So that way you'll actually know what you've changed and then be able to obviously go in and back that out through that feature once you have that kind of log of what you've done. In other vehicles or in other things, if you're messing with long coding, which basically you go into a long code and it's just a string of numbers and letters and you're changing each one of those what's called bytes to different values, and it then changes things in the vehicle based on that information. Now long coding is tough because there's no really blanket rule. Some long coatings, when you do them, if you change them, they're permanent and you can't reverse them. Some long coatings can be reversed. So potentially you could create a scenario in where you change something that you can't then change back. I don't have a list of what those things are or what specifically you would do. So that's why it's important that obviously when you're following a manual coating instruction, that under the circumstance of long coating, that you're actually doing what you're supposed to be doing, and make sure that you're meticulous about doing that. In regards to stuff about GTIs and Golf Rs, that's kind of a tough question to answer. I can say as a general rule of thumb, they're mostly the same. Everything's going to be pretty similar. There could be exceptions to that rule, but a lot of the OBDeleven stuff, and this is something that is really nice about their features, when you're using their apps, basically their apps are set up. So for example, on a Mark 7, if they're changing an adaptation channel from X to Y, and multiple things that are changing from X to Y, the way their apps are set up is that they are looking for the original value. So let's say it's X and Y and Z, and they're changing them to A, B, C. Well, unless they are X, Y, and Z, it will not change to the other value because it basically will tell you it's not applicable to your vehicle. So I like that feature about the apps because it doesn't, if it sees a value that's not correct based on the parameters that are originally set in the vehicle, then it's not going to change anything at all. So that's a nice feature, which is part of the reason why that's kind of something that you can't do too much stuff with. Now the one exception to that is if you just start going into apps and start just applying stuff wherever, you can run into issues because sometimes after you perform different apps, you have to run adaptation or readapting things like headlights because of the leveling and things like that. So I wouldn't just go arbitrarily start going crazy pushing stuff without knowing what it does or what the intent of it is. It's just a matter of finding what you want and then kind of go down the road of making that happen.
Scirocco Racer via VW Vortex says, I dropped off my Mark 7 GTI last night at the dealer for a terrible noise when going over bumps. They just informed me that the PDI was never completed and my GTI, with a whole 600 miles, needs a new suspension. How angry would you be, and would you recommend a new car, as my wife thinks? I never checked the oil or anything because it was new. What do you think?
Okay, so what he's referring to, for anybody who's not familiar, a PDI is a pre-delivery inspection. When you purchase a new car, it goes through the PDI, generally when it comes into the dealership before it even goes out in the lot. They then perform periodical checks. I think it's 90 days over the vehicle for battery maintenance and stuff like that. And dealerships all get paid from Volkswagen to do that stuff. PDIs not being performed on that specific model. That car has suspension blocks, which is basically during transport, all the front shocks in the vehicle actually have blocks in them in between where the spring goes and the actual shock itself to prevent obviously bottoming out of the shocks during shipping. They're supposed to be removed. It sounds like he purchased a vehicle, hadn't been PDI'd, and he drove for 600 miles without it. Let's start with this. That was something, just a little history on those suspension blocks. They used to come on cars when I first started with VW in 2001. All Mark IVs came with those suspension blocks in there, and they need to be removed from the vehicle. I had seen many dealerships who probably either the person failed to do their job properly or they didn't have a good process to know cars when they were PDI'd properly or whatever. And so I have seen many cars over my life with those blocks still left in them, some of them ranging in mileage that are way, way, way higher than that. That also was an issue with Mark 7 GTIs when they first came out because Mark 5, Mark 6 didn't have suspension blocks in them. So dealers actually got used to not removing suspension blocks anymore. And then Mark 7 came along, all those cars came with suspension blocks, and now the people who are doing PDIs were probably not informed that they were supposed to be looking for suspension blocks. My guess is if you go over the checklist, it says it somewhere, but they just tend to pencil whip it as they're going through it and go through the usual PDI. Not to say it's okay, just saying that's kind of how it goes down. I would say the fact that you're saying it needs new suspension, I don't know who you talk to. I've never heard of a suspension actually being damaged by those blocks. It's not super convenient or not good for it to be sitting in there for long periods of time. I've seen those things literally on the Mark IVs. There was like a collar about this big, and I've seen them smashed down to next to nothing because they've been in there for, I think 30 or 40,000 miles. I saw one that was actually in the suspension for. So that happens. I wouldn't worry about your suspension. It's probably perfectly fine. Really all that's happening, the reason why it would be kind of an unpleasant ride is because it almost creates a bottoming out of the shock before it necessarily would be bottoming out. So it's actually intended to save the shocks, and the fact that it's bottoming out is not really going to hurt the shock at all. It's just going to be an uncomfortable ride during that period. So I wouldn't worry about your suspension. I wouldn't worry about trying to get a new car or trying to get something fixed. A bunch of people mentioned in this thread that they were, you should try to get something free from Volkswagen. Maybe, ask to be taken care of for kind of an inconvenience. That would probably be not an unreasonable request, but as far as the damage to the vehicle, you kind of have nothing to worry about, and you should be okay to proceed with everything. Thanks so much for watching episode 60 of the AskDAP show, where we answer your Volkswagen Audi questions. If you have any questions or comments about the questions answered in this show, be sure to leave in the comments below. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more like it.